Let me ask you something. When someone logs into AWS and clicks around, how does AWS automatically know who they are and what they're allowed to do? Because this is one of those topics that sounds technical, but in practice, it's really just about permissions and trust. I often see people feel intimidated by IAM at first, but once you understand the basic idea around it, everything else starts to make a whole lot more sense. Welcome to Learn Data Easy. This is the series where we break down cloud, data, and AI concepts without jargon and without stress. I'm Charlene. I work in data and AI, and my goal here is to help you understand the foundations behind the tools that power modern analytics and machine learning in a way that feels practical and logical. In this episode, we're going to focus on one of the most important AWS services you need to understand, and that is the Identity and Access Management, or IAM. By the end of this video, you'll understand how AWS controls access to resources, what users, groups, roles, and policies actually mean, and why IAM is at the center of cloud security. In my experience, once IAM clicks, AWS starts to feel much less overwhelming. IAM is the service AWS uses to decide who can do what. Every time someone tries to access AWS, whether through the console, the command line, or an application, IAM checks whether that action is allowed. It helps to think of IAM as the security guard at the door. IAM doesn't do the work itself, but it decides who is allowed in and what they're allowed to touch. An IAM user represents a person or an application that needs access to AWS. For example, you might have one user for yourself and another user for an application. Users can sign in to the AWS Management Console with a password, or they can use access keys to interact with AWS programmatically. One thing I often see beginners struggle with is trying to do everything as the root user, which is something we'll talk about shortly. Managing permissions for each user individually quickly becomes messy. That's why IAM groups exist. A group is simply a collection of users with the same permissions. Instead of assigning permissions to every user one by one, you assign permissions to a group and then you add users to that group. For example, you might have an admins group, a developers group, a read-only group, and this approach makes access much easier to manage and much harder to mess up. Policies define permissions. So a policy is a document that says what actions are allowed and which resources those actions apply to. By default, everything in AWS is denied. Permissions are only granted when a policy explicitly allows them. This idea is called the principle of least privilege. Remember that. And it's one of the most important security concepts to remember for the exam and for real-world systems. Roles are slightly different from users. A role is not tied to a specific person. Instead, it is assumed temporarily by a user, an application, or an AWS service. Roles are commonly used by applications running in AWS, or when one AWS account needs to access resources in another account. I often recommend thinking of roles as temporary permission sets, rather than permanent identities. Every AWS account has a root user. This user has a full access to everything, which makes it very powerful and very dangerous if misused. AWS strongly recommends protecting the root user with a multi-factor authentication and using it as little as possible. In practice, most daily work should be done using IAM users or roles, not the root accounts. IAM sits at the center of AWS security. If permissions are set up correctly, most security risks are significantly reduced. If permissions are misconfigured, even the best infrastructure can become vulnerable. This is why IAM shows up so often in the exam and in real-world discussions. Getting this right early on saves a lot of trouble later. If you work with data or AI, IAM becomes even more important. Data access needs to be tightly controlled. Models need secure permissions, and pipelines often rely on roles to move data between services safely. Understanding IAM helps you build systems that are both powerful and secure. Let's recap the key ideas. So IAM controls who can access AWS and what they can do. Users represent identities. Groups simplify permission management. Policies define what is allowed. Roles provide temporary access. And the root user should be protected and used sparingly. If this makes sense, you've just understood one of the most important parts of AWS. In the next episode, we'll move on to compute. So we'll discuss virtual servers, serverless functions, and containers. And I'll explain how AWS actually runs applications in the cloud. If this has helped, subscribe, and let's keep learning AWS the easy way. See you next time.